Good morning, everybody. Glad you could join me, especially if you join me live, but whenever you're able to do that. Woke up to rain this morning. I didn't know it was going to rain last night, so that was kind of nice. And the guys are pressure washing my building to paint it next week, so I hope they're not too loud for us. But we'll get started and see how it goes. Well, when I was very young, not very young, when I was in high school and after high school for years, I worked for a very generous man. And I gave him plenty of reasons to fire me. I would show up for work late. I wasn't all that good at some of the work to start, and I never did catch on to some of it. But there were other areas where I was pretty good at it, so it wasn't a total loss. Anyhow, he overlooked the coming to work late and the other foibles and even helped me finish college. So it's not really clear that I would have made it to law school and then later to get to have my hobby of going to seminary if it wasn't for him. Uh, and maybe I would have found a way, or more likely, God would have found a way for me to make it happen. But I learned to be generous and to give people a chance when they mess up. Maybe we can help them overcome something in life by giving them a little help along the way, maybe a little generosity. Sometimes a little money can go a long ways in certain situations. So that's the lesson, one of the lessons from our passage today. Since God has rescued us and been generous with us, we can trust him to help us in the present and in the future, and therefore we can be generous with others. Well, in the first part of the story, chapter 29 of 1 Samuel, we see how God will sometimes supernaturally intervene to protect people from their bad choices. David had run away from Saul by going over to the territory of the Philistines. And that was a strange thing to do because David had killed Goliath, the Philistines' champion. Also, even though David usually asked God before making big decisions what he should do, this time he didn't ask God about it, either directly, he didn't ask him directly, and he didn't have the priest bring out the Urim and Thummim, which would help him make decisions. So it seems that David's faith had temporarily weakened, and he was going on about his life on his own, with his own thinking, his own abilities. Well, even though Achish, the king of the Philistines, had accepted David and seems to trust him, the rest of the Philistines do not. And so here's what happens in verses 1 to 5. So 1 Samuel 29, 1 to 5. Says, the Philistines assembled all their troops at Aphek, while Israel camped at the spring that is in Jezreel. When the leaders of the Philistines were passing in review at the head of their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were passing in review in the rear with Achish. The leaders of the Philistines asked, what about these Hebrews? Achish said to the leaders of the Philistines, isn't this David, the servant of King Saul of Israel, who has been with me for quite some time? I have found no fault with him from the day of his defection until the present time. But the leaders of the Philistines became angry with him and said to him, send the man back. Let him return to the place that you assigned him. Don't let him go down with us into battle, for he might become our adversary in the battle. What better way to please his Lord than with the heads of these men? Isn't this David of whom they sang as they danced? Saul has struck down his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. So they think that David will turn on them in the battle so he can please Saul. Achish calls David over and says, hey, It's not you, it's not me, but the rest of these guys don't trust you. So that's verses 6 and 7. It says, Achish summoned David and said to him, as surely as the Lord lives, you are an honest man, and I'm glad to have you serving with me in the army. I have found no fault with you from the day that you first came to me until the present time. But in the opinion of the leaders, you are not reliable. So turn and leave in peace. You must not do anything that the leaders of the Philistines consider improper. Well, in verses 8 to 10, David objects. What have I done? He says. It says, but David said to Achish, what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I first came into your presence until the present time, that I shouldn't go and fight the enemies of my lord the king? Achish replied to David, I am convinced that you are as reliable as the angel of God. However, the leaders of the Philistines have said, he must not go up with us in the battle. So get up early in the morning, along with the servants of your Lord who have come with you. When you get up early in the morning, as soon as it is light enough to see, leave. So Achish says, yeah, I know you're reliable, but the others have said you can't go into this battle with us. So get up early in the morning and leave. And that's what David does. In verse 11, it says, so David and his men got up early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, but the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So they're going up north to Jezreel to fight against Saul, and David heads south back down to Ziklag. Well, it's kind of mind-boggling to think that David would actually join with the Philistines and fight against Saul and the army of Israel. But that's the way it appears. Maybe David had gotten fed up with Saul chasing him around and trying to kill him, so he no longer had any loyalty left. Or maybe as the Philistine rulers feared, he would have ended up turning against them and joining Saul in the battle. Either way, it wouldn't have turned out too good for David. How could he have been king of Israel if he had joined with the Philistines and fought against Saul and the armies of Israel? Would anyone have accepted him as king? What if he had turned on the Philistines and fought against them on behalf of Israel? That would show dishonesty and a very high level of disloyalty. Do you want a guy like that as your king? So it seems that God is intervening to save David from this bad situation by turning the rest of the Palestinians, or the Philistines, against him, so that they won't allow him to go with them into battle. Instead, he will go back to Ziklag and miss out on the battle. And there's another reason for him to go back to Ziklag, as we'll see in the next chapter. Well, have you ever gotten into a situation that didn't go well, and you were disappointed that it didn't turn out the way you wanted? And then a little while down the road, you could look back and say, well, I'm really glad that didn't work out the way I wanted. I think God was looking out for me. I've heard of people who were supposed to be on a certain airplane flight, and the flight ends up crashing or having some other problem. And for some reason, they didn't make the flight. There were a lot of stories like that after 9/11, people who missed a flight or people who were supposed to be in the tower that day, but for one reason or another, they weren't there. Sometimes we miss out on an auto accident by just a few seconds, and we say, man, if I had been there 2 seconds earlier or 2 seconds later, I would have crashed. Or maybe you wanted a job really bad, but looking back, you see that the job you ended up with, the one you ended up getting, is way better than the one that you wanted. There's probably thousands of events in our lives where God intervenes to protect us or keep us on the right track. And we won't know about most of them until we get to eternity. So David gets sent back to Ziklag, and that's a good thing for him and for all of his men and for all of their families. because there have been problems in Ziklag, and David returns just in time to do something about it. And so that's chapter 30. In verses 1 to 6, it says, On the third day, David and his men came to Ziklag. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They attacked Ziklag and burned it. They took captive the women and all who were in it, from the youngest to the oldest. But they did not kill anyone. They simply carried them off and went on their way. When David and his men came to the city, they found it burned. Their wives, sons, and daughters had been taken captive. Then David and his men who were with him wept loudly until they could weep no more. David's 2 wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelite and Abigail the Carmelite, Nabal's widow. David was very upset, for the men were thinking of stoning him. Each man grieved bitterly over his sons and daughters. But David drew strength from the Lord his God. Well, they had been quite a ways up north because it took them 3 days to get home to Ziklag. Then they were horrified to see that their homes had been attacked and everyone had been taken away. They were all very upset, so much so that they wanted to stone David. So David did what we should do when we're faced with a very difficult situation. First, it says here in verse 6 that he drew strength from the Lord. So think about that for a minute. Probably David was not doing God's will when he went over into the territory of the Philistines to escape Saul. Then he's put in a difficult situation where it looks like he'll end up fighting against Saul and the armies of Israel, but God intervenes, so the Philistines' leaders won't let him fight, and they send him back home to Ziklag. So he goes home only to discover that it's been attacked. The property's been burned, and the people and animals have been carried off, including his own wives. His men want to stone him. And who can blame them, really? Well, what does David do? Excuse me. He draws strength from the Lord. So when things are going bad for us, even if it's largely our own fault, we can draw strength from the Lord. In fact, sometimes it seems like we have to hit rock bottom, get to the end of our rope, as it were, before we'll think about God and remember that we can draw strength from the Lord. And sometimes it's the Lord that takes us there to the end of our rope so that we'll turn to him. And the second thing David does is in verses 7 to 10. Says, Then David said to the priest Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, Bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod, saying, David inquired of the Lord, saying, Should I pursue this raiding band? Will I overtake them? The Lord said to him, Pursue, for you will certainly overtake and carry out a rescue. So this time David asked God what he should do. So he seems to have learned a lesson from going into the territory of the Philistines on his own without asking God. And so God says, yes, pursue them because you will overtake them and rescue them. And so that's good info to have when you're setting out to overtake a raiding party. Well, compare that to Saul. God was not answering him because he had been disobedient. Saul didn't repent or draw strength from the Lord. No, he went to a witch to get some information that he thought he needed to have. Also, David learned from his mistakes, but Saul just kept on making the same mistakes over and over again and never learning to do what God wanted him to do. Well, David and his 600 men go after the Amalekites, and along the way, 200 of them get tired and are left behind with the baggage. And then we see that God may help us along the way, as we find in verses 11 to 15, where it says, then they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David. They gave him bread to eat and water to drink. They gave him a slice of pressed figs and 2 bunches of raisins to eat. This greatly refreshed him, for he had not eaten food or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. David said to him, "To whom do you belong, and where are you from?" The young man said, "I am an Egyptian, the servant of an Amalekite man. My master abandoned me when I was ill for 3 days. We conducted a raid on the Negev of the Kerethites, on the area of Judah, and on the Negev of Caleb. We burned Ziklag." David said to him, "Can you take us down to this raiding party?" He said, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to this raiding party." Well, so they just happened to come across this guy, and it might have been tempting to kill him because he had participated in this attack on Ziklag. But they feed him and strengthen him, and then they're able to get some good intel from him. He's going to lead them to where the raiding party is staying. Well, then in verses 16 to 20, God gives David the victory. It says there, 16 to 20, so he, this Egyptian, took David down, and they found them spread out over the land. They were eating and drinking and enjoying themselves because of all the loot they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. But David struck them down from twilight until the following evening. None of them escaped, with the exception of 400 young men who got away on camels. David retrieved everything the Amalekites had taken. He also rescued his 2 wives. There was nothing missing, whether small or great. He retrieved sons and daughters, the plunder, and everything else they had taken. David brought everything back. David took all the flocks and herds and drove them in front of the rest of the animals. People were saying, "This is David's plunder." So they found the enemy down there celebrating the victory and having a party. It says they were spread out over the land, so they weren't in a very good defensive position, and that made it easy for David to defeat them. And he defeated them all except for 400 who escaped on camels. Apparently camels are very fast, a good way to travel, especially when you're trying to escape an army that's on foot. So not only did God hand the Amalekites over to David, he retrieved all of the people and all of the plunder that had been taken from Ziklag, plus much more that had been taken from others. And David's plunder is what they called it. So it was a dire situation, but God totally turned it around and used it to David's advantage. Now, ironically, one of Saul's big mistakes was not totally defeating the Amalekites as God had commanded. And here David is finishing up the job that Saul was supposed to do. So when people refuse to finish some work that God has given them, he might just take it away from them and give it to someone else. All right, then in verses 21 to 30, we see that generosity is God's way, and often it's also the smart way. So that's 21 to 30. So they're heading back with all of this plunder. Then it says, David approached the 200 men who had been too exhausted to go with him, those whom they had left at the Wadi Besor. They went out to meet David and the people who were with him. When David approached the people, he asked how they were doing. But all the evil and worthless men among those who had gone with David said, "Since they didn't go with us, we won't give them any of the loot we retrieved. They may take only their wives and children. Let them lead them away and be gone." But David said, "No, you shouldn't do this, my brothers. Look at what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and has delivered into our hands the raiding party that came against us. Who will listen to you in this matter? The portion of the one who went down into the battle will be the same as the portion of the one who remained with the equipment. Let their portions be the same. From that time onward, it was a binding ordinance for Israel right up to the present time. When David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, "Here's a gift for you from the looting of the Lord's enemies." The gift was for those in the following locations: for those in Bethel, Ramoth Negev, and Jatir; for those in Aroer, Sifmoth, Eshtemoa, and Rakal; for those in the cities of the Jerahmeelites and Kenites; for those in Hormah, Bor Ashan, Athach, and Hebron; and for those in whatever other places David and his men had traveled. So first of all, opportunities to be stingy will often present themselves. David and the 400 got all of this plunder from the Amalekites, and then on the way back, they meet up with the 200 that had been left behind. And so some of the evil and worthless men among the 400 were going to cut the 200 out of any share of the plunder. They could take their wives and kids and go home, but no share of the plunder. And so it's evil and worthless to be stingy, but it's godlike to be generous. It certainly is God approved. Proverbs 11:24 and 25 says, "One person is generous, yet grows more wealthy, but another withholds more than he should and comes to poverty." A generous person will be enriched, and the one who provides water for others will himself be satisfied. And Proverbs 19:17 says, "The one who is gracious to the poor lends to the Lord, and the Lord will repay him for his good deed." And so David is a man after God's own heart, and so he says, no, the 200 are going to share in the plunder. He understands that God gave them the plunder, and therefore they should share with these 200. God protected them and delivered the Amalekites into their hands. The 200 had gotten tired and they didn't fight, but they did stay with the equipment. And they had been part of the team in other battles. They had been part of David's group. And so therefore they too should share in the plunder. And that's just good leadership, because the people will be with you if you're fair and generous, except for the ones who are evil and worthless. And the writer says, well, this has been a lasting ordinance for Israel right up to the time that this book was written. Not only that, but in verses 26 and 30, David shares the plunder with many of the elders in Judah. And that shows not only generosity, but smarts, because this will make the leaders of Judah favorably inclined toward David when he's trying to consolidate his rule as king. Well, I learned years ago from my boss to give people another chance when they mess up, and to be generous, to try to be as generous as I can. David learned from his mistakes and other experiences to seek God's direction in his life. He learned that he could trust God to rescue him and that God would provide for him. And he learned that God is generous to his people. And therefore, David knew that he could help people and be generous too. Sometimes he could be generous just to be generous, and other times he could be generous because it would give him an advantage in what he was trying to do and become. So think about different experiences in your life and times when God saved you from harm or from making a mistake, or saved you from a mistake that you had made. Consider how God has been generous with you and given you a second chance and a third chance and maybe even a fourth chance. Then don't be like the worthless and evil men who did not want to share with the 200 that stayed behind. Give people another chance when you can and when it's not dangerous, and be generous. All right, well, let's have a little word of prayer. Thank you. Last week we prayed for my wife Brenda and the middle schoolers who were going off to camp in Central Oregon at the Washington Family Ranch, formerly the Rajneesh Ranch, but now it's a Young Life camp. Then tomorrow, the high school bunch is heading up to Canada to Malibu Club for their week at camp. But Brenda's not going unless something happens, I guess. So pray for the high school bunch and the leaders. They have to cross the border, they have to hit the ferries at the right time. So there's a lot of logistics that have to come together. And then pray for God to work in the lives of these leaders and also the kids for sure. All right, well, let's pray. Father, thank you for how generous you are with us, how you forgive us when we make mistakes and work in our lives to keep us from making mistakes. Help us to ask you before we decide to do things so that we will do what you want us to do. Help us also to be generous with others, to forgive them and share what you have given us with them, to help them overcome their difficulties in life. Give us patience. Sometimes it can be difficult, patience and endurance to watch what other people do when we know it's a mistake, but to help them nevertheless, because other people watched us make mistakes. You watch us make mistakes, and you stay with us. Pray your blessing on all the folks who tune in here, that you would use your word in their lives to make them become more like Christ. And we pray all this in his name. Amen. All right. Well, again, thanks for tuning in, and we hope to see you next week. Have a good week. It's 4th of July, so have a good 4th of July, and we'll plan to be back next Sunday. So hope to see you then. Bye-bye.